In the 21st century, it's really hard to think of an opera and divest yourself from the German Romantic movement. And so my opera is really not a German Romantic opera. It's really more modern. The story begins showing Nadia waiting to hear of Ahmed's death. Then it quickly zooms back 5 or 10 years, and what the audience eventually sees is that there's a human side to Ahmed. When he's a little boy, he's playing ball, running around, chasing girls, and eventually he falls in love with Nadia, who becomes his wife, and they ultimately have a kid together. You see the compassion, you see the love, you see the joy in their eyes. As a composer, my goal isn't to have my own voice heard, rather it's to take Nadia's story and put it on the stage so that millions of people can hear it. Her story is really one of getting caught up in Islamic extremism. Her and other women that live in Algeria have similar stories, and I think by telling this story, it can be heard by thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, and ultimately it can be the impetus for change. In this video, I want to talk to you about an opera I wrote, Letters to a Terrorist. I had the fortune of moving to New York for grad school after growing up in California for about 22, 23 years. And I moved out to New York, and it was a culture shock. In fact, within the first couple of weeks, someone died in my arms. I got to see people getting shot, unfortunately stabbed. It was a really rough area of Brooklyn that I lived in that was still filled with gang activity. And so it was a very real experience moving away from home, out of the safety and comfort, and getting to experience life in a different way. While I was in New York, I, just like in California, I would oftentimes take trips to bookstores to find different books. And so on this one occasion, I was by myself looking through a bookstore, and I came upon this book called I, Nadia, Wife of a Terrorist by Bea Gassimi. Now, this book was about this woman whose name was changed. They call her Nadia, and they say she lived in Algeria, but in the preface we read that the name of the woman and the location was changed to protect her identity, because she was the wife of a known emir, which was the head of the GIA in Algeria, or wherever she was located. So she was the wife, and she got eyewitness accounts of some of the harshest atrocities that they committed to the people in that town. It included bombings, it included beheadings, it included rapes and murders. It was really brutal, and she just, I think by the grace of God alone, got out and was able to be saved from that. She didn't end up dying from her husband or from a raid from American soldiers or from the local police. So she got out and was interviewed by a woman, Bea Gassimi, who passed away a few years ago. But they put together this book to kind of tell their story, and it's a very interesting story about kind of an insider view of what goes on. From an American point of view, it's interesting to see all of the sheer terror that she had, even being involved. And in one point she says she believed in the cause, but she fell away from that as she saw all of the murders and all the atrocities that her husband and the quote-unquote gang of thugs that he was with started to commit. So working with this kind of a text, I knew it was going to be a little bit hairy. Actually, in that time when I was living in New York, John Adams had an opera called Death of Klinghoffer that was being protested at the Metropolitan Opera because some people were saying that it showed too much of the side of the people who hijacked the boat, the terrorists who hijacked the boat, and because of that, people were getting angry that it showed the humanity of that. And so knowing that, I knew when I was writing this I had to be very careful, that I had to be super objective and not show too much of her side, but also not just show the opposite, kind of the American side. So I tried to be as true to the text as possible. I tried not to edit as much as I could, tried to just actually take her text and just set that the best that I could. Now, of course, as a composer, it's completely impossible for me to remove myself from the story because I have experiences. I've seen things happen, seen terrorist things happen. I grew up and I saw the World Trade Center just kind of fall down because of two planes that were catapulted into the buildings, and I was living at the time in New York City where that had happened. So there was a lot of that kind of in the air, and it definitely wasn't forgotten. It was still kind of in the forefront of our memories. So working with a text like this, knowing that it's going to be controversial, I still decided to use it, but I didn't want to just write a song. I didn't want to write just one piece about it. So I decided to actually write a full evening length opera, which turned into a ballet opera with dance and with instruments playing as well. So it turned out to be about an hour in length, and I used 17 movements in total to tell the story. So as I read through this, it's a relatively thin book, as you can see, but as I read through this, I made sure that I highlighted things, I underlined things, because obviously I couldn't use every single story. So I had to figure out not only the structure of the book that I wanted to use, but the structure of the overall opera. So I took time to actually copy the parts that I wanted into a Word document and ended up getting about 30 pages worth of text that I had to whittle down to about 3 pages worth of text. It was really difficult, but it was, I think, really worthwhile. So one of the texts that I want to look at, and you can listen to the whole opera, it's available on Spotify, on YouTube, or you could buy a CD if you'd like, online on Amazon. But one of the texts that I used talked about having to go along with all of this stuff. She falls in love with this young man, then she gets married to him, and then she finds out that he's involved in this gang where he's going out at all hours of the night. He's killing people, he's setting bombs, he's running from the police. And so she writes here in a movement that I titled Marriage Turns to Slavery, Part A, she writes, "I had to go along with all that was in my new house. There was no alternative. Ahmed kept telling me we have to show the brothers hospitality. Otherwise, they'll be forced to sleep outside in the cold and God will punish us. My biggest fear was divine punishment. Theirs was getting caught. It was so bad that they all slept with their clothes on, which they never took off. That way, if they were awakened in the middle of the night, they could make a quick escape. Once in a while, I had him take off his shoes. It made me sick to smell the stench. It was no use trying to get them to shower. At least he'd wash his feet." So this particular movement just shows the humanity that, yeah, Ahmed is a real person. Ahmed is someone who was afraid. He was smelly. He was a real human. And I wanted to show that there was this human side to him, that it wasn't just this force of terrorism, but there was a person behind that. And I also wanted to see or show how Nadia was a little bit kind of forced into this situation. She didn't really choose to be part of this, and her husband was the mastermind behind this. And she was afraid that, she says here, God was going to punish her, and according to her, Ahmed was only afraid he was going to get caught. So it seems like she was devout in her religion and Ahmed wasn't. So it was hard for her to see all of that happening, knowing that she was trying to please God and he was just trying to not get caught. So that was one of the texts that I decided to use. Now, I also went on in this opera to use a shorter text in Marriage Turns to Slavery. At the end, I wrote, each time one of the brothers was killed, Ahmed would weep. He envied them. He wept. Now, this was a very short text, and the movement is about 4 or 5 minutes long. And so in order to set this, I had to use a few techniques that I want to look at right now. So each time one of the brothers was killed was the longest sentence or the longest part of this phrase. And if you look at this movement, in fact, movement 10, which is Marriage Turns to Slavery, Part E, I decided that I didn't want to give away the punchline right away. So just like in my first song, I decided to wait a little bit before giving the punchline, so I wasn't right on the nose. So I said it starting with second soprano, each time one of the brothers was, and that was all I said. And then the mezzo soprano comes in a measure later, each time one of the brothers was, and then the soprano comes in a measure later. They're all singing the same thing, slightly different rhythms, and they're coming in at different points. So there's this canon happening, this canon that I took from the Renaissance period, where there's this downward scale, each time one of the brothers was, and they would sing that over and over and over and over, and finally when we reach the end of the sentence, after the third repetition, each time one of the brothers was killed, the second soprano starts that, and she has this upward scale, killed, and then the mezzo soprano comes in right away doing the same thing but a beat later, and then a beat later soprano 1 comes in singing that same scale. So I used just a simple shape. The opening was just a downward spiral each time one of the brothers was, and then as they say killed, it comes back up into kind of this backwards check mark. Now that goes on for a little while, probably about a minute. And then after that happens a couple times, I decided to set the next part. Ahmed would weep. It shows kind of, again, the humanity of him, that he was sad that his brothers were dying. It wasn't just a cold murderer, but he was sad that his brothers were dying. And then the final part of the text at the very end, he envied them, which makes you think, was he sad for them? Or did he envy them because he wanted to die? It's left open. It doesn't really answer that until the end. But in Islam tradition, if you were killed in battle, in jihad for the cause, you were ultimately guaranteed what they think is of heaven. You were guaranteed to go to heaven. And so that was one of the things he envied. He said if he got killed, then he would actually just get immediately to heaven, which in Islam there's no guarantee of salvation. So it's a place where you have to live kind of in this area of uncertainty for your whole life, which is unfortunate. Later on in this opera, I decided to put in, this is the only movement that I put in that wasn't actually from Bea Ghassemi's text, and it was called Death Has Friends. Now, Death Has Friends is super personal. It has a personal meaning to me. I'll read you the text. It says, "And he was a strong man, was a man. What a man would, what a man could do if he was a man." So it's kind of playing with this idea of broken relationships, particularly between a husband and a wife. Now, I wrote this text. It's a very simple text, and I thought it portrayed what was going on, the dissonance between Nadia and between Ahmed. The story is a little bit personal for me because when I was young, my father committed suicide. I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. And I remember he was in and out of jail in my childhood. And he called me one time, I think I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And he had just gotten out of jail and he had sent me some pictures so I could have him. And he was really buff. He had been working out and he was really buff. And so he had really big arms and he had a six-pack and all that. And I thought, even as a kid, how ironic that was, that he was in jail. He was divorced from my mom, and for whatever reason, he cared more about the way he looked. He was caring more about the fact that he was a strong man than that he was there for his kids, that he was there for his wife. So because of this death that we see in the opera where Ahmed becomes a murderer and kills people, I decided to take this story that was super personal and put it into this about suicide, basically about death. It happens as the 12th movement. So it's right towards the end when everything in the opera is actually turning on its head and all of the people are starting to die. All of the brothers are starting to die. And in fact, it's a point where everyone but Ahmed is pretty much dead. And even at the very last movement of the opera, we find out that Nadia was sitting there watching TV one night and she sees the remains of her husband. She sees him with his head cut off. And she knows that it's finally over. She has a sense of relief, but it's mixed with sadness because her husband, her marriage that she wanted, is just over. It's done with. But she's now finally relieved. She knows that he's not going to come and find her. There's no way that he can do that. So there's a bit of a bittersweet ending to where there's freedom, among the deaf. See if you can figure out this week when you're working on your own music, see if you can work on structuring a larger text into a larger song. Maybe you have only a 3-movement song, or maybe you have a piece like this, like an opera, that you want to create a story for that's 5 movements or 6 movements. See if you can structure it so that it actually tells a narrative story of falling in love, maybe, and then getting married, and then there's a twist of the plot. Something happens where you realize marriage isn't going to turn out the way I wanted to because I married a terrorist, and then ultimately has some kind of an ending. There's death, then Nadia is freed. So when you're thinking about a structure, of course, you can use a classical structure like that where there's a narrative form, and that's totally fine to do. In fact, most narrative operas do that, and it's really effective. Typically, you'll need about 15 movements to write a full opera. So if you can find 15 big chunks of music that are about 5 to 6 minutes long, you'll have yourself a full opera. So if you ever want to write yourself an opera or a large work like that, don't think about the big picture when you're starting. Think about small chunks that you can add and paste together one after the next. That will culminate into your full evening length work. I hope this has been a really helpful discussion on how to take text and to maneuver it and work with it and edit it and change it to make a song, to make a piece, or to make a full-length opera. I hope this has been very encouraging, and it encourages you to go out, find a story that you're really attracted to, that's really meaningful for you, and see if you can set some text this week either for a solo singer, a choir, or a full-length opera. Have fun with it.